When I heard his phone vibrate on the nightstand, something inside me froze. It was almost 3 in the morning and the screen lit up the dark room with a short notification. "I can't wait to have you back." The contact was saved under a neutral name, but the message carried a weight no one could disguise. My eyes burned, my hands trembled, but I took a deep breath and took a quick screenshot. At that moment, I knew something had broken. He slept soundly beside me, completely oblivious to the turmoil consuming me. His snoring, which I'd previously found amusing, now sounded like mockery. I looked at his face and felt as if I were standing before a stranger. The man who always said I was his rock, his life partner, was hiding messages that burned like a hot iron. And for the first time in years, I could no longer believe his words. There was no way to erase the image from the screen, the phrase throbbing in my mind. I knew it wasn't paranoia, it wasn't a fabrication. There was the proof I never wanted to find. Cold gripped my body, but with it a strange, almost silent force was born. I wouldn't confront it immediately. I would observe. And it was with this choice that the most painful part of my life began. I remember when everything seemed perfect, as if nothing could shake our lives. He always came home from work with a smile and a lingering kiss. He made a point of asking how my day was and seemed to genuinely listen. Sometimes he even brought flowers, even without a special date. And it was in these kinds of details that I believed in the solidity of what we had. Our Sundays were sacred. We would wake up late, make coffee together, and spend hours in the living room, watching old series. He would laugh out loud at the same jokes we'd seen dozens of times. I believed that laughter was mine alone, like a private code between us. It was in those moments that I felt safe, protected. But that feeling slowly faded. At family gatherings, he always made a point of holding my hand. He loved telling stories about how we met, exaggerating details to make everyone laugh. I blushed with embarrassment, but at the same time, I was thrilled by the pride he displayed. It was as if he were telling the world that I was his, that nothing could separate us. But things began to change almost imperceptibly. Little by little, I noticed his attention wasn't the same. His gaze seemed to pass right through me, as if he were somewhere else. Conversations became shorter, and his interest in learning about my day faded. Before, he'd celebrate my small achievements, but now he didn't seem to notice. As if what had once been special had become a dull routine. When I touched his arm, he would sometimes pull away subtly. Not abruptly, but enough for me to feel it. A gesture that once signified affection was now rejected. At first I thought it was fatigue or work stress. But the frequency increased, and each departure became a silent stab. I also began to notice the way he dressed up more. New perfume, starched shirts on ordinary days. Before, I was the one who insisted he take better care of himself, but suddenly it wasn't necessary. He dressed up on his own, as if he had someone to impress. Distrust grew like a constant shadow behind me. His phone became an inseparable extension of his hand. It never sat on the table like before. Password changed, notifications silent, screen always facing down. It seemed small, but in reality it screamed loudly. It was as if he wanted to hide something that couldn't be discovered. I remember one night we were on the couch and he received a text. The glow of the screen reflected on his face and I saw the suppressed smile. I asked who it was and he replied too quickly, "Just the people from work." But his expression betrayed something else. His heart already had a destination elsewhere. I tried to push those thoughts away, to convince myself it was insecurity. But intuition never fails, and my body knew what my mind refused to accept. With every detail, with every silence, I felt something was wrong, and this premonition wouldn't leave me alone. It was an ordinary morning that everything seemed more obvious. He left home early, saying he had an urgent meeting. The problem was, his calendar was open on his computer, and there was no meeting at all. I stored this information away like someone hoarding ammunition for a silent war. At lunch, I tried to broach the subject carefully. I asked if everything was okay, if I wasn't working too hard. He smiled coldly and said I was worrying too much, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. I'd known this man for years, and I knew he was lying. That same week, he started coming home late. Always with ready excuses, always smelling of a different perfume. It wasn't the scent of our bed, nor the soap he used. It was something else, sweet and strong, lingering in his shirt. That strange aroma became invisible evidence for me. The tone of his calls also changed. Before, he'd answer on speakerphone without a second thought. Now, he'd leave the room, lower his voice, and close the door. I could feel the distance widening with every unspoken word. It was like watching a wall being built between us, brick by brick. Intimacy also disappeared. It wasn't just the touching, but the way he looked, the desire to be close. Desire was replaced by indifference. I still tried to rekindle the flame, but it was gone. It hurt to realize it wasn't just fatigue, but absence. Sometimes I caught myself remembering the promises he made. I'll never leave you insecure. You're the woman of my life. These phrases echoed in my head like mockery. How could someone change so much in such a short time? It was as if I were living with another man, disguised inside his body. Even our friends noticed the difference. A friend commented to me, "He's been distant. Is everything okay?" I smiled and pretended I was, but inside I was shattered, because I knew she was right. That distance wasn't just in my head anymore. It was visible to anyone who cared to see. The small gestures betrayed me every day. He changed his phone's ringtone, changed passwords, and became irritated by simple questions. I, who had always been an accomplice, was now treated like an invader, as if he lived two lives and was afraid I would find out. I remember one night when I went to hug him, and he pulled away almost automatically. It didn't feel like tiredness. It felt like rejection. It was then that I realized his love no longer included me. I felt a crushing loneliness even though I was beside him. It was like sharing a bed with a stranger. To keep from going crazy, I began writing down everything I observed. Schedules, excuses, smells, glances. It was my silent diary of trials. Each line written was also a vent, a way of not screaming. I already knew something big was about to surface. Sundays lost their charm. There was no longer coffee in bed, no laughter over old series. He was always busy, always in a hurry. I feigned normalcy, but inside I just wanted answers. And each absence was another open wound. He started leaving early for the gym, always impeccable, as if he were going to a fashion show. The strange thing was that he returned with no sign of exertion, no sweat, as if he'd never trained. And what hurt most was realizing he no longer cared to hide it. Even in trivial conversations there was a coldness. He responded in monosyllables, avoiding eye contact. I talked about my plans and he showed no interest. Before, he celebrated every step with me. Now, he seemed to be hoping I'd give up on everything. One day, as I hugged him, I noticed his shirt was exuding an overly sweet perfume. I asked what it was, and he quickly replied, "New fabric softener." But I knew how to distinguish perfume from fabric. The lie was on the tip of my tongue, and trust was increasingly distant. I could no longer sleep peacefully. I spent hours awake, listening to his movements, waiting for clues. Any notification made me jump out of bed. It was like living on constant alert, trapped inside my own house. The messages were the tip of the iceberg. I knew there was much more behind it, a whole world hidden behind passwords and excuses, and I was about to enter that world without asking permission. My mind wavered between anger and sadness. I wanted to confront him, but I also wanted to be certain. Something inside me told me I needed proof, not just intuition, because I knew he would deny it until the end. I began to observe his schedule more closely. He took different rides, spent more time on simple routes. Everything seemed calculated to avoid any trace. But still, small slips slipped through. And I was aware of each one. The excuses became repetitive. Backlog of work, last-minute meeting, difficult clients. But I knew exactly when he was lying. The intonation, the way he played with his hair, the averted gaze. I read his body like an open book. Every detail reinforced what I already feared. He was no longer mine. What we had built was crumbling without my being able to stop it. But something inside me refused to accept it passively. If he thought I would never find out, he was wrong. That night, lying beside him, I made a decision. I wouldn't be the naive wife he believed he was manipulating. I would observe silently, unhurriedly, until I had the truth in my hands. Because once that truth came out, nothing would ever be the same again. The truth was about to reveal itself, and I just needed the right moment to expose it all. That week, something changed even more clearly. He began to drop small gestures that had previously been automatic. There was no longer the goodbye kiss before work, nor the quick text asking if I'd had lunch yet. His silence screamed louder than any words. I knew I was losing ground in his heart. On Friday, I told him I'd stay late taking care of some unfinished business. I stayed home, alone, looking at the clock and counting the minutes. Remembered when he'd call me just to say he missed me. Now he seemed to be escaping me. His absence was becoming increasingly unbearable. I decided to call to confirm, and the call went straight to voicemail. This put me on alert because he always answered, even when he was busy. I tried again and the result was the same. My heart raced and the feeling of being deceived overcame me. I was teetering between doubt and certainty. When he arrived, much later than usual, he carried a strange scent of perfume. It wasn't mine, nor was it his. I asked how his day had been, and he replied vaguely, "Tiring. I'll tell you later." But he never did. It ate away at me. I began to observe every detail more carefully. The schedules, the clothes, the excuses. I was no longer just a wife, I was an investigator in my own home, and this version of myself frightened me, because I didn't want to be like that, but I had no choice. On Saturday, I invited him out. He said he was very tired, that he needed to rest. But later I saw in the reflection of his glasses that there was a message notification, "Looking forward to seeing you." The words flashed on the screen like a silent confession. I swallowed hard and decided not to ask anything. I kept it to myself like someone guarding a loaded gun. He didn't notice, but every detail registered in my mind. Every unspoken word, every suspicious gesture. I was building a puzzle that would soon reveal the complete picture. On Sunday, he received a call in the middle of lunch. He got up from the table and went to the balcony. I watched him through the window, gesturing with my hand and smiling. It wasn't a work smile, not a neutral smile. It was an intimate smile, like the one that had once been mine alone. When he returned, I asked who it was. He replied curtly, "Nothing important," but his eyes betrayed it. It was as if each short answer was an invitation for me to investigate further. And the more he tried to hide it, the more I became certain something was up. I decided to test his reaction. I asked if he wanted to travel with me on the next holiday. He hesitated, saying he might not be able to. Before he would have been excited, made plans. Now he seemed to be making excuses. The emptiness between us only grew. That night, rummaging through his drawer, I found a receipt for dinner at an expensive restaurant. It wasn't common for us to go there, and I hadn't been with him that day. The price was high for 2 people. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was another piece fitting into the puzzle. I said nothing. I put the receipt back in the same place, as if I hadn't seen it. But the weight of that proof kept me awake all night. He slept beside me, and I looked at him with anger and sadness. How could he lie so well looking into my eyes? On Monday, I noticed he left earlier than usual. He got in the car and said he needed to stop by the bank. I became suspicious and decided to write down the exact time. Later, I checked with the app. There were no appointments scheduled for him that day. It was another blatant lie. I started a routine of taking notes. I wrote down every suspicious detail in a hidden notebook: departure times, excuses, smells, messages. I didn't want to go crazy with doubts. I wanted concrete facts. And each page filled was a heavier weight on my chest. At times I tried to deceive myself. I thought maybe I was exaggerating, seeing things where they didn't exist. But when I looked at him, the coldness was impossible to deny. He was no longer the man who shared dreams with me. He was someone hiding a parallel life. At dinner, I tried to bring up our future. He quickly changed the subject, talking about work and business. I felt like I was talking to a stranger. It was clear he no longer wanted to share plans with me, and that hurt more than any lie. That same night, I saw him change his ringtone again. Now, it was barely noticeable, a low beep he could hear even from far away. It was proof he didn't want me to notice. But the more he tried to hide it, the more I noticed. The time he spent at the gym also began to bother me. He said he'd trained for hours, but he'd come back without any sign of exertion, no sweat, no wrinkled clothes. I knew he was using that place as an excuse, and the lie was no longer even creative. I started noticing his clothes too. Some had scents I didn't recognize, others had subtle makeup stains. I couldn't hide the lump in my throat anymore. It was too cruel to ignore. One night I decided to look him in the eye. I asked, "Are you being honest with me?" He looked away, smirked, and replied, "You're very suspicious. You need to relax." The answer only confirmed everything I already knew. The way he tried to turn the situation around hurt me even more. It was as if I were to blame for being attentive. The gaslighting became a daily occurrence, and I had to remain firm to keep from going crazy. He played with my mind, but I wouldn't give in. One morning, I saw him rush out and leave his smartwatch on the table. My heart raced. I opened his step log and saw he'd been to places outside our routine. Hotels, remote streets, meeting points. The proof was there, plastered on the screen. I kept this information to myself without saying anything. It was my ace up my sleeve, something he never imagined I'd have. It felt like I was preparing for an invisible war, and I knew I needed to be strategic. I began to think about how to act. Confronting him head-on didn't seem right, because he'd deny it until the end. I needed to build up, let the truth grow until it could no longer be hidden. That was the only way to turn the tables. Silently, I began to prepare myself emotionally. I didn't want to be just a victim. I wanted control. The pain was immense, but with it came a strange strength. A strength that only arises when someone is betrayed. Even so, there were days when I cried alone in the shower. I felt the water fall and wash away part of who I was. The mirror reflected a tired but resilient woman. I didn't want him to see my weakness. I needed to keep up the facade. With every lie, every excuse, I grew stronger. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I learned to endure. Betrayal is cruel, but it also opens your eyes. And I was no longer the same woman who believed in every promise. I began to see the world through different eyes. Friends, family, work. Everything seemed different, as if I'd lost my innocence. And maybe that was it. My innocence was gone. I no longer saw my husband as a partner, but as an enemy within the home. Even so, I continued smiling at family dinners, feigning normalcy. No one could suspect anything yet. I needed the right timing, the exact moment. Because when the truth came out, the impact would be devastating. And that night, as I watched him turn to his side and sleep, I realized I was more prepared than ever. Not to endure the lie, but to tear off the mask he wore every day. His fall would be hard and I would be there to watch. From that moment on, I began to observe everything as if it were a slow-motion film. His every gesture seemed to carry a secret. Every word carried weight. I didn't need cinematic proof, just attention to detail. And the details were everywhere. My heart already knew the answer, but my mind demanded confirmation. One day, during breakfast, I noticed he was in an unusually good mood. He was singing softly, smiling at his phone while stirring his coffee. I asked who he was talking to, and he simply replied, "With the company people." His haste in answering gave me away more than his words. It was as if he were always ready to escape. I watched the wristwatch. He never took off. I knew it synced with his phone and recorded everything. One day, when he forgot it in the bathroom, I saw a notification for a night run. He never ran at night. The destination was a remote neighborhood, not part of our routine. This detail haunted me all day. He had left work early, saying he was tired. But the steps recorded on the app showed he had been on the move for 2 hours. Every number, every kilometer recorded was like a silent confession. In his car, I began to notice the smells. The upholstery had a sweet, cloying scent that wasn't mine. When I questioned him, he said he had given a coworker a ride. The excuse seemed plausible, but my suspicions only grew. The strangest thing was the way he reacted to my questions. Before, he'd answer patiently, even laughing. Now, any question was met with impatience. He'd raise his voice, turn away, and end the conversation, as if I were an intruder in his life. I felt like I was being tested, as if he wanted to know how far my blindness would go. And, out of pride, I pretended to believe him. But each lie was a step on the ladder I was silently building, a ladder that would lead directly to his downfall. I began to notice changes in his credit card. Purchases at restaurants we never frequented. Gifts from jewelry stores, women's clothing, all without explanation. When I asked, he said they were for important clients, but I knew clients didn't wear perfume on their shirts. I started sleeping less. Any notification at night put me on alert. Once I heard the vibration and realized it was a message at 2 in the morning. He got up quickly, went to the living room, and typed for almost an hour. I stayed in my room, pretending to sleep but feeling every second like torture. The next morning, I asked if he'd slept well. He said yes, as if nothing had happened. His coldness made me burn inside. I wondered how anyone could lie while looking someone in the eye without trembling. But perhaps that was what strengthened me most. I knew his disguise had an expiration date. The gym became the perfect alibi. Almost every day he said he was going to work out. But one detail caught my attention. The towel came back dry, as if it had never been used. His body showed no signs of exertion. It was just another excuse to disappear for a few hours. I became more attentive to his clothes. Well-ironed shirts, neat pants, even on days without commitments. I knew his style, and that wasn't normal. When I questioned him, he'd say he was taking better care of himself, but I knew it wasn't for me. The conversations of a couple were no longer a thing. Before, we'd discuss trips, dreams, even life's problems. Now he only talked about business, as if it were a barrier to keep from revealing anything personal. I tried to bring up an intimate subject, but he always cut me off. It was as if there was no longer room for me in his life. One night, he left his computer open, and I went to get a glass of water. The browser showed hotel searches in areas we'd never visited. My stomach churned, but I quickly closed it to avoid leaving a trace. It was another piece that fell into place. I no longer felt like arguing. I kept everything silent, like someone preparing for a sure blow. The diary he kept was full of notes. Each line was like ammunition. I knew that when the time came, nothing could be denied. Even in the way he spoke to me, I noticed changes. Before, he'd complimented my clothes, my food, my ideas. Now, he seemed to find fault with everything, as if he were trying to justify the betrayal to himself. The weekends were no longer ours. He'd make excuses to go out, saying he had urgent matters to attend to. I pretended to believe him, but I knew there was another hidden agenda, an agenda that didn't include my name. When he returned, he always had a ready excuse. And I was impressed by his calmness when lying, but inside I smiled, because each lie only confirmed what I already knew, and the more he lied, the closer I was to falling. Once, I saw him looking at his phone and laughing to himself. I asked him what was so funny. He replied, "Nothing, just a joke in the group." But his eyes shone differently. It was the sparkle of someone talking to someone they desire. I also noticed he avoided physical contact. A quick kiss, a distant hug, nothing deeper. As if his body were somewhere else, and this physical absence was more painful than any excuse. At work, gossip began to surface. A colleague mentioned that she always saw him with someone. I hid it and didn't let it show, but inside something burned. I didn't need witnesses, but hearing that was like a punch. I began to feel invisible in my own home. I was there, but he no longer saw me. He prepared the food, took care of things, but it was as if he didn't exist. This indifference was as cruel as betrayal. One night I noticed he changed his clothes before leaving, even though he said he was just going to the grocery store. It didn't make sense. He returned without any groceries, but with his perfume permeating it. It was impossible to ignore. I considered confronting him, but knew he'd deny it. He was a master at turning the tables. He said I was seeing things, that I needed to trust more. I had this manipulation script memorized. But this time I wouldn't fall for it. My greatest strength was silence. He believed I suspected nothing. But behind the calm facade, I gathered every piece of evidence, and this was the weapon he would never see coming. I remember looking at him sleeping and thinking, how can someone betray me so coldly? I no longer recognized him. It was like living with an actor rehearsing a role that was no longer mine. Little by little, I realized it wasn't just about betrayal. It was also about respect, about dignity. I could no longer allow him to diminish me while I lived another life. And this knowledge gave me strength. Still, there were nights when the weight was unbearable. I cried silently, swallowing the pain. But at dawn, I rose stronger. Because I knew that each day brought me closer to the moment of revelation. I didn't want cheap revenge. I wanted justice. I wanted him to feel firsthand what he did to me. I wanted the world to see who he really was, without masks. This idea grew within me like a flame, and when I least expected it, an unexpected detail fell into my lap. A small mistake, but enough to dismantle the entire disguise. It was the beginning of the truth emerging on its own, and I was ready to seize it. His slip-up happened so simply it almost seemed careless. He arrived home in a hurry, dropped his coat on the sofa, and went straight to the shower. In his pocket, his cell phone vibrated twice, and the screen lit up. I couldn't resist. I walked slowly, glanced, and saw a preview of a message that said, "It was amazing yesterday. I want it again." I felt my body tremble, but I suppressed the urge to open it. I didn't want to leave a trace. I needed to be careful. I took a deep breath, jotting down the time and the phrase in my secret notebook. Each written word burned me inside, but also gave me more strength. I knew confirmation was near. When he got out of the shower, I asked him how his day had been. He responded distractedly, talking about meetings that never existed. His face seemed light, almost relaxed, as if he'd experienced something pleasurable. That expression wasn't tired, it was satisfied, and it was like a silent stab. At dinner, he secretly checked his phone. He turned the screen down whenever a notification arrived. I smiled on the outside, but inside I was on fire. The ease with which he lied was absurd. Only this time I already had the proof written in my memory. The next day, he left his car parked on the street in front of his house. When I went to get something from the glove compartment, I saw a small bag forgotten. It was a jewelry box, with a receipt dated the day before. It wasn't for me, I was sure of that. That gift had a specific destination, and it wasn't my hand. My heart pounded, but I put the box back. I wanted him to think he had everything under control. The worst revenge would be to let him believe his own lie. Because when the time came, the fall would be much more painful. Little by little, I realized he was leaving clues himself. Perhaps out of confidence that I would never suspect. Perhaps out of carelessness. Perhaps out of excessive vanity. The fact is, the trails were scattered, and I was learning to piece them together. I even began to pay attention to his tone of voice when he spoke on the phone. It was softer, lower, almost complicit. It wasn't the way he spoke to clients, or even friends. It was pure intimacy, and that intimacy wasn't mine. One night, while he was showering, I heard a voicemail coming in. The female voice said, "I can still smell you on me." My body froze, and the phone nearly slipped from my hands. I held my breath to keep from collapsing right there. The confirmation was beyond doubt. I left the bedroom, sat in the living room, and remained still. Anger mingled with a strange calm. It was as if the truth had finally materialized before me. I no longer needed to guess. It was all there. The betrayal had a voice, a smell, and words. He came out of the bathroom, looked at me, and asked, "Is everything okay?" I forced a smile and said yes. He believed me, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. In that moment, I realized his mask was intact, but so was mine. I continued to save every detail. I began organizing folders on the computer with screenshots and notes. I had saved audio files, photographed receipts, recorded appointments. It was like assembling a secret dossier. I didn't yet know how I would use it, but I knew the right moment would come. In the following days, he seemed increasingly distant. He'd come home, eat quickly, and lock himself in his office. He'd say he was sorting out company documents, but I knew it was another excuse. His muffled laughter betrayed it wasn't work. The bed grew cold. He'd turn to the corner, avoiding contact. Before, he'd seek my embrace. Now, he'd flinch at the slightest touch. It was like sleeping next to an empty body. The physical absence was crueler than any lie. I decided not to insist. Silence became my greatest weapon. He believed he was in control, but he didn't realize he was being watched. His every move was studied. And this gave me a strange sense of power. Even small details, like the way he styled his hair, showed signs. He spent more time in the mirror, putting on perfume even for simple tasks. I knew he wasn't for me. Every spray of that expensive perfume was a stab in the back. One night, the Uber he'd ordered arrived earlier than expected. The phone screen showed the destination, a hotel downtown. My heart raced, but I pretended not to see. I wrote down the name of the hotel, like someone recording a valuable clue. It was just another piece of the puzzle. Then he returned, making excuses for a late-night meeting. I smiled, pretending to believe him. Inside, I just wanted to scream. But I knew keeping it to myself was better. Each accumulated lie pushed him further away from the possibility of escape. The most painful part was living with normality, making coffee, cleaning the house, sitting next to him. It was like acting in a poorly rehearsed play. I knew his lines, I knew them, but I chose not to interrupt. Even during family time, he seemed disconnected. At Sunday lunches, he would secretly check his phone. I watched silently, pretending to smile at the conversations. But my mind was elsewhere, calculating every detail. Sometimes I wondered if he thought I was naive, if he believed I would never notice. Maybe that was his confidence, the certainty that I would remain silent. But he had no idea how prepared I was. I began to realize that even his friends had changed their attitude toward me. They avoided looking at me, averted their gaze when they talked about work. I felt they knew more than they were letting on, and this only reinforced my certainty that the betrayal was visible to everyone but me. At that point, I no longer sought answers. I simply sought the right moment. Because the truth was already before me. I just needed to choose the moment to use it. Every lie he made became fuel. The pain made me strong, and the strength made me patient. I learned to smile even knowing the truth, and that was the greatest disguise I could use. Silently, I began to plan my next move. Maybe it would be gathering all the evidence. Maybe it would be confronting him suddenly. I didn't know yet. But I was certain of one thing: he wouldn't get away with it. One afternoon, while rummaging through his drawer, I found another receipt for an expensive dinner, accompanied by 2 glasses of wine. The date coincided exactly with the night he said he was in a meeting. It was perfect proof, clearer than ever. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The world seemed to spin, but I didn't let my anger overcome me. I put the receipt back where it belonged, pretending I'd never seen it. Because victory wouldn't come in a hurry. It would come at the right time. What he didn't realize was that every mistake he made was my weapon. The more confident he became, the more evidence he left. And the more evidence I gathered, the closer I was to the end. He was digging the hole he'd fall into. I knew the revelation would be painful. But I also knew that when it happened, it would change everything. He would no longer be able to deny it, and I would no longer be able to go back. That night, as he slept soundly, I looked at him in silence. I no longer saw my husband. I saw only a stranger. A man about to lose everything, and who didn't know it yet. The clock was ticking, and the moment of his downfall was near. His routine began to become predictable in its lies. He'd say he'd go to the gym, but he always came back with his hair impeccable and his towel dry. I knew I was going somewhere else, and his calmness only reinforced my certainty. I noted every departure, every return, like a timer. The pattern was clear. One detail caught my attention one night. He returned with his shirt wrinkled, but there was no sign of training. On the contrary, there was a faint, sweet scent, a feminine perfume mingling with his. The impact was immediate, as if someone had rubbed the truth in my face. I pretended not to notice, but I made a mental note of it. Once, while doing laundry, I found a restaurant napkin in my pants pocket. The name was of an expensive place we'd never been to together. The date printed on it coincided exactly with the night he said he was stuck in a meeting. It was impossible not to connect the dots. When I confronted him about something simple, like his sudden change of perfume, he rolled his eyes. He said, "You've been paying too much attention. It's unhealthy." His tone wasn't affectionate, but contemptuous. It was as if I were the crazy one in the story, but inside I only confirmed the manipulation. Even the way he drove changed. Always attentive to traffic, he was now distracted, smiling alone in the car. He took different routes home, claiming traffic jams. But I knew he was creating ways to hide his other life. He underestimated my ability to perceive. One rainy night, he left, claiming he'd forgotten documents at work. I waited 15 minutes and called the office. The secretary, unaware of the lie, said he hadn't been there. I felt my stomach churn. It was the clearest proof I was living a deception. Still, I showed no reaction. I feigned normality when he returned, wet only from drizzle and with a grocery bag. He said he'd taken advantage of the trip to buy a few things. The detail was that the items in the bag were too dry for someone who had supposedly walked in the rain. But the way he tried to convince me was almost insulting. It was as if he didn't believe in my intelligence. And that was the cruelest part, realizing that someone living next door thinks you'll never put the pieces together. I was tired of playing that role. On his phone, the messaging apps were now password protected. He'd never done that before. When I asked, he said it was for company security. The justification seemed rehearsed, but his eyes wavered. It was in that hesitation that the truth emerged. One morning, I received the card bill in my email. Among the expenses were hotel reservations in my name, but I'd never booked them. He'd used my profile to disguise it, but he'd forgotten that the receipts would be sent to me. It was like a punch straight to the chest. I stood paralyzed, staring at the screen, as if in disbelief. The betrayal was no longer in suspicions. It was in paperwork, in official documents. There was proof that could not be denied. I saved the email in a secret folder, knowing it would soon be invaluable. When he came home smiling, I asked him how his day had been. He said he'd been rushed, that he'd spent the afternoon in meetings. I looked at him and thought about the saved email. Each word he said was another brick in the wall I was building. Sometimes I caught myself staring at our reflection in the mirror, me with tired, steady eyes, him with the serene face of someone who believes he controls everything. It was strange to think that the man beside me was the same one I once swore to trust. The duality hurt. At family gatherings he tried to hide it, but the distance was palpable. He didn't participate in conversations, staying on his phone. My relatives asked if everything was okay. I smiled, saying yes, but inside everything screamed. It was like carrying an uncomfortable secret in front of everyone. I decided to intensify my silent investigation. I started checking his statements, his emails, the small traces he left. There was no need to hack anything. He indulged in small oversights himself, and each slip was enough to give me more certainty. One day while washing the car, I noticed a strand of hair stuck in the passenger seat. Blonde, long, nothing like mine. I held that strand between my fingers and felt a mixture of anger and relief. Anger at the confirmation, relief that I wasn't imagining it. The truth was concrete. I didn't tell him anything, just put the strand in an envelope. A small detail but loaded with symbolism. It was like a trophy of my patience. Each piece of evidence piled up, and I knew the weight of it wouldn't hold for long. Even his way of speaking changed. Before, when he got home, he'd say, "I miss you so much." Now he'd just say hi and head to his room. Love slipped through his fingers like sand. And I no longer struggled to hold it in. I struggled to understand how far he would go. He became irritated when I asked simple questions. "Where have you been?" was enough to raise my voice. Aggressive behavior was the defense of someone who was guilty. But I didn't argue, because every scream of his was a disguised confession. One afternoon, while organizing documents, I found a forgotten note in his jacket pocket. It said, "Thank you for the night. It was unforgettable." The handwriting was delicate, feminine. I held the paper like a blade. I no longer needed anything. Still, I remained silent. I put the note back in the same place, as if nothing had happened. I wanted him to believe he was safe. The fall would be greater when he discovered I knew everything. I began to reflect on who I was in that relationship. I wasn't just a wife. I was a spectator to a lie. And this realization was the most painful, because I understood I was living with someone who no longer existed. Looking back, I remembered the happy times. The trips, the laughter, the plans. Everything seemed so distant. It was as if that man had died, and in his place only a sham remained. This realization broke me inside. Even so, there was a part of me that wanted to believe in redemption. I thought, what if I'm wrong? What if it's just paranoia? But all it took was remembering the note, the perfume, the hotel. Reality spoke louder than any illusion. He began to be absent even on weekends. He said he needed to get work done, but he didn't take a laptop or documents. He left feeling light, as if he were going to something pleasant. And he returned with the same hidden smile. Even the way he got ready for bed changed. He started wearing new, more sophisticated clothes, even at home. It was a strange, unusual vanity. I saw it as preparation for someone, but not for me. In a moment of carelessness, he left his email open on his computer. I saw messages exchanged with restaurant reservations and intimate compliments. I read just one line and closed it, feeling my palms sweat. I already had enough material to dismantle the entire charade. Still, with each discovery, I felt the weight increase. It wasn't just about proving he was lying. It was about accepting that my life was falling apart beyond my control. The ground was falling apart, and I needed to reinvent myself. The nights became long. I looked at him sleeping and felt anger, pain, and even pity. Because I knew I was building a sandcastle, ready to crumble. And I would be the silent witness to it all. Until, in an unexpected moment, he made the mistake I'd been waiting for. A trivial detail, but one that would put all the pieces in place. It was the beginning of something bigger, something that would change the way I viewed that whole lie. His mistake was so trivial it surprised me. He hurried home and threw his jacket over the chair. In his pocket was a crumpled hotel receipt, with the name printed in large letters. I took a deep breath, picked up the paper, and felt the ground disappear. There were no more doubts, only facts. The receipt showed a room for 2, paid in cash. The date was the night he swore he was in an endless meeting. I stared at those letters as if they were a sentence. My heart pounded, but my mind was cool. It was the proof I'd been waiting for. I sat on the sofa and turned the paper over in my hands. Part of me wanted to throw it in his face right then and there. But another part knew the impact would be greater if I waited. It wasn't just about catching him, it was about exposing him irrefutably. I decided to wait a little longer. When he got out of the shower, I asked him how his day had been, smirked, and told a made-up story about clients. I looked at his face and thought, "You have no idea I already know everything." This thought gave me a strange power. In the following days, he became even more confident. Thought he was in control, that he fooled me easily. He smiled, made jokes, even hugged me more as if trying to disguise his guilt, but his every gesture only reinforced my repulsion. I no longer saw a man, I saw only a farce. I realized he always used the same excuse: meetings. They were early morning meetings, Sunday meetings, holidays. And I wrote down each one, building a perfect chronology. When I put it all together, the lie would be exposed without needing an explanation. A close friend mentioned that she had seen him entering a restaurant with a woman. He pretended not to tell me the details so as not to hurt me, but it was too late. I knew. I choked back tears, thanked him, and feigned indifference. But inside, my stomach churned. I began to feel like an actress in my own life. I smiled in public, cooked, cleaned the house. But deep down, I was already plotting the outcome of the story. He believed I was naive, but he didn't realize how lucid I was. Even his most intimate habits changed. He started taking his cell phone even to the shower, something he'd never done before. He'd return with it protected in a towel, as if it were a treasure. It was clear. The parallel life was all there. I considered stealthily reaching for the phone several times, but I knew a password could ruin my chance. I preferred not to risk it. My eyes were trained to capture any visible detail, any notification, any reflection, and something always appeared. One night, the mirror's reflection showed the phone screen, a name saved with initials, nothing compromising. But the message said, "I'm already in my room waiting for you." My blood ran cold. I smiled on the outside, but my mind was exploding. He entered the room minutes later, as if nothing had happened. He sat next to me and asked if I wanted to watch something. His naturalness was frightening. I accepted, sat close, but all I could think about was how he was able to live 2 lives without stumbling. Even when it came to money, he began to contradict himself. He would withdraw large sums in cash, but never justify it. When I asked, he would reply, "Business demands discretion." I pretended to believe him, but I kept the hotel receipt as my strongest card. One afternoon, I realized I had bought new clothes, hidden in the trunk of my car. Women's clothes, still with tags. He believed no one would see, but I saw them. It burned in my hands like court evidence. I put everything back without touching it. I didn't want to ruin his performance. I wanted him to feel safe, so he could fall deeper. The fall of someone confident is always more painful. My body was already reacting differently. I no longer felt love, I felt repulsed. His touch bothered me, his smell nauseated me. I endured it because I knew I had to endure it until the right moment. But each night was an internal battle. At home, he continued to pose as the exemplary husband. He hugged, smiled, made a point of appearing affectionate. Everyone believed him, and it tore me apart. It was like watching a play, knowing the backstage was rotten. I no longer cried. The crying had given way to a strange coldness. It was as if the suffering had become a strategy. I was no longer a victim. I was an observer of an inevitable downfall. Once he came back so distracted that he forgot to hide his phone. I saw a notification flashing. It was the best night of my life. I didn't need a password. I didn't need to open anything. Just reading those words was enough to make my stomach churn. Even so, I continued acting normally. I asked about work, about weekend plans. He responded with ready-made, rehearsed stories. But I already knew that every sentence he said was just part of a poorly written script. At night, lying in bed, I wondered how anyone could live like this. 2 lives, 2 masks, 2 people. The man I knew had died, and in his place was a mediocre actor. This realization strengthened me. I decided I wouldn't show my pain. He didn't deserve my tears. He deserved only the silence that precedes the explosion, and I was getting closer and closer to that point. In the following days, he began to contradict himself more and more. Once he said he was in a meeting at the same time the receipt showed he was in a hotel. Another time he said he'd gone to the grocery store but hadn't brought anything. The lies began to collide. This collision was proof that his disguise was crumbling. He could no longer keep the narrative intact. I saw his mask unraveling, detail by detail. And that made me certain the end was near. The most painful thing was realizing that, at some point, I had believed every word. I had defended, trusted, surrendered. And now all of that was being trampled. This wound would never fully heal. Even so, I needed to stand my ground. It wasn't just about me. It was about showing that no one can play with another's trust like that. I needed to turn pain into proof, and proof into strength. He believed he was in control, but I already had the truth in my hands. The receipt, the note, the audio, the perfumes. Everything lined up in a straight line that pointed to betrayal. And once I revealed it, there would be no way out. I began to look at him as if he were a stranger. The man who shared my bed was no longer my husband. He was just someone about to lose everything. This vision gave me the coldness to follow through with the plan. The nights grew heavy, the silences unbearable. I felt the air heavy as if the house were complicit in the lie. And every time he looked at me, I wondered if I would ever have the courage to admit it. Until, in one simple moment, I saw the opportunity arise. A social gathering, close friends, a relaxed atmosphere. There, in front of everyone, it would be impossible to hide. And I already knew exactly how to use the evidence I had stored for so long. The gathering was at a well-known restaurant, frequented by mutual friends. There was no escaping the watchful eyes, the casual questions. He groomed himself more carefully than usual, applied excessive perfume, and fixed his hair several times. I simply watched, silently, my mind already made up. It was the perfect setting to expose what I knew. We arrived together, but the distance between us was visible. I greeted friends, smiled, and chatted. He, on the other hand, seemed uncomfortable, surreptitiously checking his phone. That anxiety was a reflection of his guilt. I noticed every detail, every nervous gesture. At one point, a friend commented on his schedule. She asked if the nightly meetings weren't tiring. He smiled, saying everything was under control. I just stared at him, and inside I smiled. Because I knew that sentence would fall like a house of cards. I ordered a wine and let the conversation flow. He spoke loudly, trying to appear relaxed, telling old jokes. But there was something forced, an exaggeration in his posture. It was the usual theater, but I was about to pull back the curtain. I waited for the right moment. When everyone was at the table, I took out my cell phone and placed it on the tablecloth. I discreetly opened the folder with the evidence I had gathered. The first file was the hotel receipt. Without saying anything, I slid the screen to his side. Silence spread in seconds. He paled at the sight of the image, but tried to compose himself. He said quickly, "This is nothing. I don't know where you got it from." But his voice trembled and his eyes wouldn't hold. The discomfort was so evident that even his friends were shocked. I took a deep breath and continued. I then showed him the photo of the note found in his jacket. The clear, feminine handwriting thanked him for the unforgettable night. I didn't need to say anything. The message spoke for itself. He tried to laugh it off, saying it was a joke from a colleague. But no one believed him. With each piece of evidence I showed, he cringed more. The audio with the female voice, the credit card statement, the location history. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just presented it. It was like dismantling a carefully constructed lie piece by piece. The atmosphere grew heavy. Friends who had previously laughed now looked on in bewilderment. Some looked away, others frowned. He tried to hide it, but he was already cornered. No argument could undo that evidence. I remained calm the entire time. It wasn't impulsive revenge, it was calculated exposure. I wanted him to understand the weight of his betrayal, not just to me, but to everyone. The silence of those present was the greatest judgment possible. At one point he raised his voice. "You're exaggerating, you're interpreting everything wrong." I stared at him firmly, without lowering my gaze. I didn't need to respond. I simply opened the last image, the hotel reservation in my name, paid for by him. There was no denying it. The mask slipped completely. He turned red, sweated, and mumbled incoherent words. The confidence he always displayed vanished before everyone's eyes. I simply watched him, like someone watching a play come to an end. The lie no longer had a stage. One of my friends commented quietly, "What a disappointment." Another shook her head silently. The social judgment had been cast. He who had always cherished the image of a man of integrity was now seen for what he truly was. This was the true downfall. I calmly got up from the table. I simply said, "I didn't need to prove anything, but you made a point of leaving clues." He tried to follow me but was paralyzed by the stares. The weight of shame was greater than any words I could muster. I left the restaurant feeling a mixture of pain and relief. Pain at publicly confirming the betrayal. Relief at finally no longer carrying the secret alone. The world knew, and he had nowhere left to hide. On the way home, the silence inside the car was deafening. He tried to make conversation, saying everything could be explained. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, not responding, because I knew any word I said would be wasted. When we got home, he tried to justify himself again. He used the same excuses as always, the same repeated phrases. But now, they sounded pathetic. I no longer saw my husband, just a desperate man trying to save what no longer existed. I closed the bedroom door and sat on the bed. My body trembled, but my mind was calm. I knew I had taken the first step. His fall was already irreversible, and I had the strength to carry on, even alone. In the living room, I heard the sound of nervous footsteps, his cell phone vibrating insistently. He was still trying to contact the other woman, even after the exposure. This only confirmed how lost he was. There was nothing left to rescue. I lay down and closed my eyes, feeling the tears fall silently. It was no longer sadness, it was liberation. I knew that from that moment on, my life would change forever. But what I would discover in the following days would make everything even more devastating. In the days that followed that night, the house felt like a minefield. He paced back and forth, trying to justify the unjustifiable. Rehearsed phrases, meaningless explanations, empty promises. I just watched him without responding. The silence was more powerful than any scream. With each attempt to convince me, I remembered the evidence I carried with me. The receipt, the note, the audio recordings. There was no erasing what was already recorded. His lie had been exposed, and there was no going back. I felt strangely strong, even with my heart aching. He began to change his strategy. If he couldn't deny it, he tried to change it. "You walked away first. You never have time for me." His speech was full of veiled accusations, but it didn't work. I knew it was just the last defense of a cornered man. In the calm moments, I saw him sitting, head down, staring into space. The arrogance he'd always carried had vanished. All that remained was a broken man, unsure how to sustain his own charade. And curiously, this didn't bring me regret, only greater clarity. The routine continued, but nothing was the same. We drank coffee in silence without exchanging glances. The heavy mood hung in the air, making every meal torture. I no longer made an effort to hide it. The mask had slipped, and I no longer needed to act. At times I wondered how I had gotten there. I remembered the years of complicity, the trips, the late-night conversations. Everything seemed distant, almost belonging to another life. The contrast between past and present was overwhelming. He tried to regain my trust with gifts, expensive flowers, perfumes, impromptu dinners. I accepted silently, but every gesture felt out of place. It wasn't affection, it was desperation. And his desperation didn't heal the open wound. One afternoon, the house phone rang. On the other end, silence and heavy breathing. When I said hello, the line dropped. My instinct told me it wasn't a mistake. It was her, trying to probe, to test boundaries. It ate away at me inside. The most painful thing was feeling like everyone around me already knew. The glances from some friends, the interrupted comments, the whispers. The betrayal was no longer just between the two of us. It became public. And that hurt even more, because the humiliation extended beyond the walls of the house. That night, I heard his phone vibrate incessantly. He tried to hide it, but I saw the screen light up with long messages. He pretended to be asleep, but his fingers moved discreetly. His obsession with the lie was greater than any attempt at reconciliation. In those moments I reflected on my life, on how I had allowed him to get this far, and how so many women go through the same thing, in silence. Betrayal isn't just a physical act. It's a slow emotional destruction that consumes every part of the person who trusts. Anger gave me strength. It wasn't just for what he did, but for what he tried to make me believe. The manipulations, the excuses, the gaslighting, all of it was as cruel as the betrayal itself. And I knew I needed to transform this pain into something greater. One morning I decided to go out early and walk alone. The fresh air brought me clarity. It wasn't just about a broken marriage, it was about dignity. I needed to regain mine. Because he had already lost his forever. When I returned home, I found him sitting, dejected, begging for a chance. He said he would change, that he would do anything. But his eyes still held secrets. I could clearly see there was no regret, only fear of losing what he still had. It was then that I understood. His downfall wasn't just in the evidence I had gathered. It was in his own behavior, in his desperation, in his lack of truth. And my strength would come from exposing, not only to others but to myself, who he truly was. After days of living with that burden, I began to notice something that had previously eluded me. It wasn't just the betrayal hidden in hotels and strange perfumes. It was the daily neglect, the way he no longer bothered to hide his coldness. Indifference was the cruelest sign of all. He'd come home, throw his keys on the table, and walk right past. He no longer asked how I was, didn't seek conversation. I'd just head to his room, locked away with his cell phone. This lack of care hurt more than any suspicious message. It was as if I were invisible. I also began to notice the increased spending. It wasn't just hidden gifts, it was constant transfers, cash outflows. He wasn't just betraying my trust, but also the future we'd built together. He was investing in another life, as if I didn't exist. At a family dinner, the eyes on us were different. I sensed curiosity, doubt, even compassion. It was obvious the rumors had spread. His pride, which had always thrived on his public image, was beginning to crumble. Amidst all this, I felt a strength grow within me. It wasn't just anger or pain anymore, it was clarity. I knew I had nothing left to lose. The betrayal was no longer a private secret. It was already a social failure. He tried to offer me trips, expensive dinners, promises of a fresh start. But with each attempt, I saw only desperation. The gleam in his eyes wasn't love, it was fear. Fear of losing his image, his status, the comfort of having someone who could keep up appearances. I remember one night when he looked me in the eye and said, "You can't ruin our lives like this." And that was the moment I realized it wasn't about us, it was about him. About the comfortable life I represented, while he lived his parallel fantasy. This realization freed me. From that moment on, there was no room for regrets. I no longer sought explanations, no longer wanted excuses. I wanted distance. And above all, I wanted to regain the respect he had ripped from me. I began to plan my exit calmly. I reviewed accounts, organized documents, prepared every detail. I didn't want to depend on him for my next move. The betrayal had shown me that if I didn't take care of myself, no one would. Meanwhile, he continued to try to maintain control. With rehearsed phrases, exaggerated gifts, even forced caresses. But it all felt false, staged, and I no longer reacted. It was like watching an actor at the end of his career, stuck in a role that no one believed in anymore. The days at home became unbearable. The silence was heavy, and any attempt at conversation ended in fights. I no longer saw any point in prolonging it. The relationship was dead, only sustained by appearance, and I didn't want to live in a facade anymore. I started to reflect on how many women had already gone through the same thing. How many swallowed tears in the shower, how many faked smiles in public, how many blamed themselves for a mistake that wasn't theirs. This reflection made me feel that my pain was collective, not individual. I realized that the betrayal wasn't just his. It was also from a society that allows women to be silenced, manipulated, and discredited. I wasn't the first, nor would I be the last. But I could choose not to remain silent. I could choose to get up. When I made this decision, I felt something inside me reborn. The woman he tried to reduce, that he tried to deceive, was back. Firmer, more aware, more self-possessed. He had lost not only my trust, but the chance to have me by his side. And that's why I say it's not just about cheating. It's about respect, about dignity, about not accepting less than we deserve. Because in the end, the greatest strength is not in exposing his lie, but in reconstructing the truth of my own life. And it is at this point that the question echoes, how many will remain silent in the face of the signs that are already out in the open?